Hey guys, and welcome to /Rex Games. So today we're going to be adding projectiles to our networking game. This is quite exciting. If I open up my Sprite, so you can see that I've created a tomato. I know it's really tiny, but there it is, pixelated tomato. We're going to be throwing tomatoes at our enemies. So as always, I've got the server on the left and the client right here on the right. So you've seen the projectile. Let me just actually show you the throwing animation. Here we go. If I edit this and check the preview, you can see he throws. Let's put this at about 8. It's going to be similar to that. Every time he gets to pretty much image 3 over here, that's when we create the projectile. Okay, cool stuff. So a while back, one of my subscribers said, hey JP, why don't we replace all the code to do with the encoding of our sprite number with simply sprite index, right? And then it matches on the other side and things will be fine. So the thing about this is sprite index will work because the ID assigned to this sprite is from top down. That'll be 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, etc, etc. But one thing we need to make sure is that clients are connecting to our server have the same version number. Now this is a big thing that we're going to have to revisit at a later stage because I am going to actually remove this number encoding that we got over here. So later on at a certain period of time we want to make sure that the version numbers of the clients are the same throughout the game. So the server is going to say, hey guys, I'm accepting version 1 on this server. If anyone tries to connect to me from anything lower than version 1, we're just not going to allow that. Okay, cool. So let's go ahead and pretty much nuke all this code here. And then, as I already did earlier, I changed this to sprite index. Okay, so that's a 7. It hits our server, which also sends a 7 response back. So let's go to handle incoming packets here on the client side. Let's open up this. Let's look for 7. Here it is, and we can take all of this code out and replace it with sprite index equals sprite number, just like that. Okay, so that's one thing I wanted to get out of the way. Another thing is I want to be able to change the player's direction depending on where the mouse is. So the mouse is to the right, the player must face the right. If it's to the left, the player is going to change to face the left. And that's so that when we do click the mouse to create a projectile, it's going to be thrown in that direction. And it's not going to look like our player is throwing projectiles behind him all strangely. So in object local player, let's head into the step event. I'm going to create a script called scr mouse check right over here. And let's go ahead and create that. And it's going to say, well, if I'm not pressing the left key, and I'm not pressing the right key, so if he's just idle, the player's just standing there, I'm going to say var d equals point direction x, y, mouse y. And here I'm going to say, well, if d is greater than 90 and d is less than 270, then direction equals left. Else, simply dir equals right. Cool stuff. So that's going to change his direction, just like that. And we'll see how that works at a later stage. So let's jump into the creation of these projectiles. So in local player, I want to create a variable here called projectile count. Now we need to track these projectiles. They'll already be given the ID of the owner. But remember, multiple projectiles can belong to the same owner, which means that when it comes to destroying them, I don't want to destroy all the projectiles at once. I want to destroy a very specific projectile. So it's going to need 2 identifiers that come together to form a unique identifier. That's going to be the owner ID and this projectile count, which is just another integer. And let's set that to 0. So every player starts with a 0. Alright, so let's copy this. I'm going to go add event, mouse, global, left pressed. Some coding here. Let's make this bigger. Now obviously I can only throw something if I'm standing. Now I've noticed also I have to put in that I'm not jumping and I'm not falling. Just like that. My new state is throwing. And if I'm throwing, I need to call an alarm over here, which is going to go off at about 1/4 of a second. And that's going to reset us to the standing phase. So that's enough time to go through the entire throwing animation, and then we'll just say state equals standing again. Cool, so now I'm going to create 2 variables, var xx, initialize that to x, and I'm going to create var yy. So this is so that we can create this projectile a little bit offset from the origin of our player's sprite. So let's check the direction. And if it's right, well then I've worked it out that XX must equal the origin of the player sprite plus 26 pixels to the right. And the YY must equal the Y origin of the player and 10 pixels up. Otherwise, it's pretty much the opposite. XX equals X minus 26, and YY still equals minus 10. So actually we can grab that YY and initialize it to that value instead of having to repeat this. Cool stuff. So I'm going to go ahead and create the projectile. At XX and YY. Now I haven't created an object for this projectile just yet. We'll get that in a second. Let's say projectile dot speed equals 8. Projectile dot direction equals point direction X, X, Y, Y, and let's do mouse X, mouse Y. Okay, so that's going to fling it towards the mouse. Let's say projectile.owner equals the global player ID. And then let's say projectile.projectile ID equals that projectile count from earlier. And then we can actually take projectile count and increase it by 1. Cool stuff. So next, let's tell the server that we've created a projectile. And I'm going to steal some code from the local player. Let's grab this. Paste it in over here. So, things we need to tell the server. We need to tell the server our global player ID. We need to tell the server this projectile count. Then we should actually put this one down. We should tell the server the XX and YY coordinates of that projectile, and that's pretty much it. So let's get rid of those. Let's fix some indentation. And let's look at these types. So we've got a U8, that's fine. This can actually change to something else. We'll have a look in a second. U32 is great for player IDs, and it should be the same for the projectile count. Then these should both be float 32s. Okay, so we need to send a tag. This was a 7. Let's see what's available on our server side. Let's go for 11. If we have to do an 11 response, let's see if we can go to here. Is 11 available? Great, 11's available on both sides. That's perfect. So let's change this to 11. So that's going to send all the information of this projectile that we need. So at line 4 we referenced alarm 0. Let's go ahead and create that before we forget. And that's just going to reset our state to what it was before, which was standing. Good stuff. Now thinking about standing, we've introduced a new sprite. That's Sprite Man throw. We need to head into our scripts over here, particularly set sprite, and there needs to be something in here that sets our sprite to throwing if we are in fact throwing. That's going to happen over here. Case throwing. Let's add a break. So the sprite index is going to be SPR man throw right at the bottom, and our image speed is going to be 0.2. I think was a good one that I tested out earlier. It's smooth enough. Now obviously if you want a really smooth throwing animation, you're going to have to add extra frames to that sprite. Cool stuff. So now let's go create that object projectile. Let's give it a tomato. Blam over there. Let's add a create event. It needs to have a few properties. One being a lifespan of 1000. We're going to decrease that per step. Let's make it affected by gravity. Let's initialize its owner to 0. And its projectile ID also to 0. So gravity is going to make it curve towards the ground, which is really cool stuff. And let's add a draw event. We're going to draw self. Then I'm going to draw set color to see white. I think it would be appropriate if we displayed the ID, or the owner's ID in fact, of that projectile, just so that we can see that things are working well. Draw text. X, Y, minus 50 should be out of the way. String owner. Then we want this to destroy itself when it comes into contact with the outside of the room, or a collision event between itself and a block. So we can actually grab the instance destroy event there. I don't use these drag and drops often, but it seems appropriate. Just like that. Cool stuff. So now we have created a projectile on our client side, and we need to tell the server about what's happened. So head back into local player. Let's open up that global left press. Let's take a look here. So what is an 11? We got a player ID, we've got a projectile count, X and Y. So handle incoming packets on the server side. Let's scroll all the way down. Let us create a case 11 over here with a break at the end. That is 1, 2, 3, 4 variables that we need to grab. Let's find one with enough. Here we go. Let's just grab those 4. Let's put them down here. First one is going to be PID. What's next? Projectile count. So let's call this projectile ID. Then we've got an XX and a YY. So those were both U32s, and the last two were both F32s. So when I was designing this tutorial, I figured we could get these case statements to do two things. If the server side reads a tag of 11 with a player ID, projectile ID, and the X and Y coordinates, what we can do is we can look at the projectiles currently in existence on the server and say, well, if something matches up, then this is actually going to be a movement change. You know, the client's telling us that that projectile has moved, and we need to tell all the other clients. If it doesn't exist, well then let's just create it. So both creations and movements requests from the client are both going to hit 11 and hit different parts of this 11. It's going to be fantastic. And in doing so, we can reuse quite a bit of code. So I'm going to start with var projectile equals no one. We don't know who this projectile is. We're going to say with object projectile, which we will create in a second, if self dot owner equals PID and self dot projectile ID equals this one, projectile ID, well then projectile equals ID. Cool stuff. So after this with statement, we've either got a reference to an instance of an object or we don't. And that's what we're going to be saying here. Well, if projectile is not equal to no one, right? Well then that means that this is a coordinate update. Simply like that. However, if the projectile is still equal to no one, even after this bit of code is run, it means we need to create it, because it doesn't currently exist. And doing so is as simple as saying var p equals instance create at xx yy object projectile, again, which we'll create in a second. Let's update his owner to PID and his projectile ID to that of projectile ID that's being passed in, simply. And that so far is all we need. So let's go ahead and create this projectile on the server side. Let's close the client side stuff, get that out of the way, expand objects, create object projectile. Doesn't need a sprite, remember we're not representing anything on the server side. Add event, it needs some properties, being owner and projectile ID. Can initialize both of those to 0. Alright, so let's close down that projectile. We don't need him for quite some time. Cool stuff. So now that we've either moved a projectile that is existing or we've created one, we need to tell all the clients in the game that something's happened. Now we only want to tell players about this change if they're currently in a game. So the last thing we want is to create tomatoes if one of the other players is in the main menu. He doesn't want to see that. So let's scroll up. Oh, look at this. Tell this player about other players. Here we're actually looking at something about player in game and stuff like that. It's going to be something very, very similar. Cool. So let's actually do something like that down here. Let's see if we can grab some code. We can grab that. We can grab that. Do some brackets. Create some space. Let us grab the stored player socket over there. Let's grab this bit of code there. Okay, so if it's not the guy that sent us this message, well, we're going to do a similar thing as before. Var player equals no one with object player. If self dot player socket equals stored player socket, well then player equals ID. And if player is not equal to no one, if player dot player in game, so if he's in a game, then it means he needs to see this projectile. And let's scroll up. Let's grab some code from one of these. Let's go for this one. Just like that. Fix some indentation. So things we need to send back. We need to send an 11 back. So that's a response to this 11 over here. We need to send the PID that came through earlier. We need to send the projectile ID that came through earlier. And we need to send the XX and YY that came through earlier. So we can get rid of these last two. Those both need to be F32s. These two need to be U32s. So just like that, we've told every player in the game world, note I said in the game world, not in the game, in the actual game world, that they need to create a projectile on their side to represent what just happened. So now before I go and jump into the client side, handle incoming packets to intercept this 11, I'm going to actually send the second packet with an 11 in that does the movement, just so that for completeness sake you can see how both sides of this use the same case statement. So let's keep that open on the left. In object projectile on the client side, let's create a step event. And it's going to do some interesting things. Let's make it twirl a little. Let's decrease its life by 0.5. Let's destroy it if that life gets less than or equal to 0. Then let's write a message to the server telling it that this object has changed position. And I'm going to actually steal some code from the local player. Let's grab all of this. Actually, we can even grab the comment right over there. Again, it's an 11. You can actually go into global left pressed. Grab this bit instead. Okay, so let's put that over there. Fix some indentation. It's an 11. Matches with that 11. We got our global player ID, which is going to match with this one. We've got the projectile count, which is actually going to be the projectile ID. And this variable comes from there. Then we've got the X coordinate and the Y coordinate. And that's going to hit up here. It's going to go down here. This is going to succeed in updating projectile to the ID of the object it can match with, which is then going to hit in here. It's going to update our X and Y's. It's going to skip this bit, and we're going to hit the tell other players about this change part. Cool stuff. So one other thing we've got to do before we head back into our client is actually what happens if a player joins while there are projectiles in the air. It doesn't seem fair that a player could join and all of a sudden he's got this invincibility mode where he doesn't see anything, can't be touched by things that might be flying around. All other clients will see their projectiles hitting him, but if they were created before he entered the room, he doesn't know about them. So let's go into handle incoming packets on the server side. Let's go to the change room request, player room change request, right over here where there's a 6. So we do some interesting things. Here we do if the player is going to the game room. So this is where we need to make this change. We're telling this player about other players. Cool stuff. Go down. We're telling this player about active NPCs. That's great. So let's tell this player about existing projectiles. So it's going to use a very similar structure as this one. Let's paste it down here. So for var I equals 0, I is less than the instance number of object projectiles. We're going to say var projectile equals instance find. Well, it's going to be the ith instance of object projectile, we're going to seek to a 0, and actually we can go down to our 11 over here, all this code, and copy it. Scroll all the way up. To this, and replace. And fix the indentation. Just like that, we're sending an 11. We're sending certain other things. Now, obviously, we don't have access to these variables. So instead, we need to say projectile.owner, projectile.projectileID, projectile.x, and projectile.y. Just like that. Cool. So we're actually finally ready to get back to our client and intercept this 11, which, just like on the server side, either means a movement or a creation. So let's accept that. Let's go to the client. It's going to end up in handling incoming packets over here. Let's make this big enough to see. Scroll all the way down to 11. Just like that. So exactly the same way we did in the server side. If I open that up here on the left, we extracted 4 variables from the buffer. So the player ID, the projectile ID, and the X and Y coordinate. We're again going to determine if this projectile already exists. We're going to do a little test, but this time I'm actually not going to be testing on the object projectile. I'm going to create a new variable called object remote projectile, similar to the way we have a local player and a remote player. So they're still going to have similar variables like the owner and the projectile ID, but obviously we don't want remote players sending any messages to any servers. It's just going to act as a representation of the other player's projectiles. So again, if projectile is not equal to no one, let's update the X and Y coordinates of this projectile if it's found. Otherwise, let's create a new one. Projectile at the X, at the Y, which happen to be XX and YY. The projectile's owner is PID, and the projectile ID is projectile ID, just like that. And if we look here on the left, notice how much of the code on this server matches the code on our client. See, this is what we're trying to achieve here. We're trying to achieve the same solution on both sides, so that if we need to make changes to the one, it's very easy to make the same changes to the other. Things don't look strange. So I'm going to create this remote player on the client side. It also needs the tomato sprite. It needs a create, which has the owner, which is going to be initialized to 0, and the projectile ID, which is also going to be initialized to 0. We're going to have a draw event, which does similar stuff to the normal projectile. Okay, so that's going to draw itself and then the owner's ID. Alright, so there's actually only one thing we have to do to finish this off, and that's the destruction of a projectile. Right over here. Hits a block or goes outside the room. It destroys itself. So now we need to tell the server that it has done just that. So let's add a destruction event. Drag in some code. Let us grab code to send a message. Let's put it over there. Now the last one we used was an 11, which means 12 should be available. We only need to send 2 things to the server, and that's our global player ID and the projectile ID, both of which are U32s. So let's intercept that 12 on the server side. So that's after 11, case 12. We need these 2. And I can actually grab the code that was used to find the projectile. That's this one over here. Copy that. Paste it down here. And instead of updating some sort of variable, I'm just going to tell it to destroy itself. Simple as that. And obviously when we do something here that should affect everyone, let's go and tell everyone about this change. So we can copy all of this code, paste it down here, and forward those 2 variables to a 12 on all the clients. Save that. Handle incoming packets. Scroll down. Copy these first two of the case 11. Let's create a case 12. Paste them in. Copy with object remote projectile. Paste it down here. If things match up, same story. Instance, destroy. So that about wraps up everything we need to do to create a projectile, update the coordinates of a projectile, and destroy a projectile in GameMaker Studio's native networking solution. So I'm going to run through those steps again with you just so that you're abundantly clear with them. In our local player, when he presses the left mouse button, it's going to create an instance of projectile. It's going to send an 11 with the player ID and the projectile count, as well as the X and Y coordinates of that projectile to the server. Remember, that's an 11. That's going to get intercepted by handle incoming packets on the server side. Let's go all the way down to 11, right over here. It's going to extract those variables. It's going to attempt to find the projectile in the server. If it doesn't, it's right over here. Then it's going to create it. And then we're going to tell all the other players that a new projectile has been created. And that's going to send an 11 back to the client. So let's head back to the client side handle incoming packets here on the right side. Scroll down. 11. Let's extract those properties from the buffer. Let's attempt to find the remote projectile on our side. If we can't find it, well, then we create it. And that ends that piece of communication. And that's the projectile create. Next, let's go and have a look at the projectile move. An object projectile step event. There's a bit of code over here, which we send an 11, the player ID and the projectile ID, as well as the X and Y coordinates to the server. The server gets that in handle incoming packets right over here, down at the 11 again. Extract those from the buffer. Try to find the projectile in existence on our server side. And we actually do find it. That's going to hit over here. And we just update the coordinates. Simple as that, X and Y's. Then we tell the players that someone in the game world has a projectile that has changed. That's going to send an 11 back to the client into the handle incoming packets over there. Scroll all the way down. 11 hits this again, tries to find it. This time it does, updates its coordinates, and that's the end of that communication. Lastly, destruction. Object projectiles destroy event sends a 12 with the player ID and the projectile ID. That gets intercepted by the server here on the left, all the way down in a 12. Extract those from the buffer. Try to find the projectile. If we do, destroy it. If we don't, well, doesn't matter. If it doesn't exist here, it's cool. But either way, we can still tell everyone that it shouldn't exist on their side either. That's going to send a 12 with the owner's ID and the projectile ID, which happen to be that projectile count. Ends up on the client's handle incoming packets, right at the bottom with the 12. Extract those from the buffer, find the instance of that object remote projectile, match it up, and destroy it. And that ends all three communications right over there, and everything to do with projectiles. Now, there's one thing that I need to bring up that we're going to have to revisit at a later stage because this video is getting too long, and that's something called dead reckoning. So basically, if our player is lagging really bad, he's getting some connection troubles, we don't want everyone else to suffer for that. We don't want those projectiles from him to lag about on all the other clients because he's only updating that projectile's coordinates like once every second if he's having a really bad day. So Dead Reckoning hopes to solve this by using the speed and the direction of a projectile and keeping it going along that path when the server isn't receiving packets from that player, and so that all the other players can still continue with their gaming experience without having to suffer for that one guy. So we'll get to that at a later stage. So I've just remembered there's actually one thing we need to do before we test this. We need to head into platform mechanics, into the script stand check, and here where we do the duck key, I need to say if state is not equal to throwing. Cool stuff. Otherwise that'll prevent the sprite change from happening. Here we are in the game room. We can chuck things around, and remote projectiles are being created when they need to be. Check that out, and those IDs match up. Sam's an 8, so when he flings something around on my side here, at the top it's being created on his side with that correct ID, just like that. So that about wraps up projectiles. Soon we're going to be taking a look into Dead Reckoning, because obviously we don't want player lag to affect how the transfer of information is happening. So I hope you found this tutorial educational and helpful. Please feel free to comment, rate, and subscribe. If you have any questions, put them in the comments below and I can try to help you out. If you like this video as well as many of my other videos, I invite you to check out my Patreon campaign. It does take quite a lot of time and effort to make one of these videos, so I really do appreciate your support. If you enjoy killing time with mobile games, check out Element Earth on the Google Play Store as well as the Amazon App Store. Project files for this tutorial is straight in the description. You can also follow me on various social media networks, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, things like that, where I post all sorts of updates on what I'm doing next. And I think next time for this tutorial is either going to be Dead Reckoning or we're going to be saving the player's position so that when he returns to the game from an earlier session, he'll be right where he left off. So until then, happy coding, and I'll see you then.